It was dingy, dusty, deserted. From the looks of it, nobody had been in this room for years. Blind chance was the only reason he had stumbled upon it. Nothing but pure luck. Or was it? Albert Franco had recently inherited his parents' house. This fortune came to him as a result of the misfortune of his mother. 2 weeks before, she had died. Passed away peacefully in her sleep is what the doctors had told him. He figured they meant to give him peace of mind with this piece of information, but the fact that his mother was gone left him with very little peace. The last 10 years of her life had been full of despair. They had for both of them, ever since his father, Nicholas, had gone missing. When it had happened, the police had told them they would do everything they could to find him, but it had now been 10 years, and in the last decade, there had never been one trace of evidence found. Not one. So here he stood in this room he never even knew existed. All these years, the house had stood holding this secret. Finally, it spoke. But what was it saying? He had discovered the door behind a shelf filled with boxes. Those boxes had been there for as long as he remembered. With the exception of his mother's private library in the far corner, the basement was used only for storage. Rarely did he venture here during his visits. There was no reason. Normally, this discovery would have simply served as an interesting little surprise. But what he saw in this room was more than interesting. There were signs everywhere that someone had been there. There was a chair and a desk, for instance. Given that this was a small room, this furniture took up about 50% of the space. On the desk were notebooks. 2 of them. Both had the appearance of age, but one was obviously older than the other. He opened that one first. It was filled meticulously with numbers. It appeared to be written in some kind of code. After each set of numbers, there were dates. The earliest year listed was 1950, and after each date was what appeared to be initials. They were CS. CS, he thought to himself. He didn't think he knew anyone by those initials. Perhaps the previous owner before his parents? Setting this book aside, he picked up the other. When he looked inside, he saw pretty much the same kind of writing, whatever code it was. There were a few differences, however. For one, the dates were later, of course. The earliest was the year 1982. Strange, he said, the year I was born. Also, the handwriting was noticeably different from the first notebook, but the difference that got his heart racing was this. The initials at the end of each line were no longer CS, but NF, and those initials were his father's. That night, he couldn't sleep. He had taken both books with him when he left the house earlier. He wasn't sure why. It's not like there was much of a narrative written, unless he could crack the code of numbers. What exactly had his dad been up to in that room? Who was this mysterious CS person who had seemingly been up to the same thing before him? He flipped through every page of his father's notebook and found no clues. The only thing that seemed to have any significance was that the last entry his father made was a week before he had gone missing. This may have meant nothing. Did he expect there to be entries after he disappeared? Of course not. He set the notebook aside and opened the other. Seeing the random numbers go by as he flipped the pages kind of reminded him of trying to count sheep as a child. Perhaps this would send him into a peaceful night's rest. Before that could happen, he suddenly stopped flipping. His eyes were wide open, and any hope of getting any sleep that night vanished in an instant. In the middle of the page, after the numbers and initials, something else was written. It was a question. It said, "Why does it only happen at midnight?" Somehow he did manage to get a few hours of sleep, but it wasn't until morning. Fortunately, this was a Saturday, so he wouldn't have to worry about going into work. Previously, he didn't have any real plans for this day, but he had one now. He intended to spend the day at his parents' now empty house, and nothing would stop him from being in that room when the clock struck midnight. The day passed even slower than the night. He tried to keep himself occupied by going through the things in the house. This was a task that was going to take weeks, maybe even months. His parents had accumulated more than anyone should in one lifetime. Some of it valuable, some not. Distinguishing between the two was going to be a real chore. By the time 11 o'clock rolled around, he made sure he was in the newly discovered room, notebooks in hand. He didn't know if or why he would need them, but it somehow seemed fitting. He closed the door behind him, so he sat in the dark room with only the flashlight on his phone for illumination. He spent this hour going back through the notebooks, looking for some kind of pattern in the numbers. They had to mean something. Lost in his calculations, he did not realize night arrived. When it did, his phone battery died, which was curious because it was well over the halfway mark. The darkness this created in the room did not last long. A light much brighter than that of his phone was suddenly in his eyes. At first, he closed them, but slowly noticed that he could open them to see the source without too much difficulty. On the back wall, which was to his right, was a large, swirling light. Perplexed, he didn't know what to do. He was expecting something to happen, but not this. The thought that came to the forefront of his mind was that there were at least 2 other people who had experienced this, maybe several times before him, so he must not be in immediate danger. He stood up and took the couple of steps it took to close the distance to the wall. He reached out and touched it, quickly pulling back his hand. It was not hot to the touch. There was no pain whatsoever. He touched it again and realized he was able to push his hand through, so he did. The thought came to him that maybe this was some kind of portal. He had heard of such things, but never believed they were real. He was suddenly overcome with a flurry of excitement. Without thinking any more, he stepped through. He was no longer in the room. The previous day, he had discovered another room in the house. But what he found here was so obviously something else. He was outside. There were plants everywhere. He was in some kind of jungle, and it was daytime here. He turned to look behind him. The portal was still there. Knowing he would need to find it to get back home, he decided to walk ahead in a straight line. No getting lost allowed. This did not prevent him, however, from looking side to side as he walked, taking in some strange sights. The first thing that became glaringly apparent to him was the lighting. As said before, it was obviously daytime. The warmth and the light made this apparent. But the sunlight seemed different than what he was used to. It had a bluish tint. If the sun here were blue, that could only mean one thing. It was not his sun. It was not the sun of Earth. The portal had seemingly not transported him to another place on our planet, but perhaps another planet, or another dimension. He was able to breathe without difficulty, so the atmosphere seemed safe, at least for now. After walking for about 5 minutes, he pushed through a large bush. He stopped dead in amazement. This bush had been blocking the view of something he never thought he would see in real life. It was a pyramid, the kind he had seen pictures of from Egypt. He now forgot all about keeping track of his path and ran towards it. Upon reaching it, he had a light bulb moment. This massive structure, which was even larger than he ever imagined a pyramid would be, was completely covered in small writing. Writing was small, meticulous lines of numbers. He was now upset with himself that when he had walked through the portal, he had not brought the notebooks with him. Could these be the numbers which were being copied down? If so, why? What did they mean? His father and CS obviously thought they meant something. Who were the people or beings that built this structure? Why had they carved the numbers? His fatal mistake had been made before he realized he was doing it. It was probably 20 to 30 minutes before he realized he had abandoned his straight line walking. In examining this pyramid, he had lost track of his path to the portal. Frantically searching the area, he realized finding it would be difficult. All of the plants looked the same. A sense of relief hit him when he saw what appeared to be the beginning of a trail. This had to be it, right? He began down the trail. Doubts started to rise about whether this was the way he had come, and then they were solidified by what he saw. There was a small clearing ahead. He knew he had not seen this on his way to the pyramid. In the middle of the clearing was a stone. It did not take him long to see that it was a tombstone. When he reached it, he was relieved to find letters, not numbers, covering it. That relief turned into shock when he saw what it said. Nicholas Franco. This was his father's grave. This was why he had disappeared without a trace. With tears welling up in his eyes, he spoke to the air. "Dad, what happened to you?" After having said this, a more troubling question occurred to him. Who had buried him?